Good afternoon and welcome to Pittsburgh City Council's Cablecast Post Agenda on zoning for Wednesday, March 19th, 2025. For the record, we're joined by Council President Lavelle, Councilwoman Warwick, and we have invited guests that are going to speak. And online we have Dan Friedson, who will help us navigate some of these questions and concerns. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, Megan? And then Sean, and then we'll get Megan, you can do your presentation. And we're also joined by Councilwoman Strasburger, who just came in.
Thank you. And just a bit of housekeeping as my delays is I'm deaf myself and wearing 2 hearing aids, and so the acoustics in this room are terrible, but the captions being live and the interpreter being on the screen is fantastic. As I thought I would have to use my computer, so it's just a little bit of delay with me following up on what you're saying.
Yeah, I have a delay too, so don't worry about it.
Thank you. So my name's Megan Hammond. I'm the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh. We're a private nonprofit that does fair housing activities, and I'm excited to dig into how the city applies and has a history of applying a fair housing lens to its housing activities.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Sean Burke, Legislative Projects Manager for the Office of the City Clerk and City Council, and I'm just here to answer any questions members may have.
Thank you, Sean. And Dan Friesen is online, so we'll just call him on when we need him. And we're also joined by Councilman Bob Charlin. And we had Jonathan Kamen invited, but he was unable to be here. I found out yesterday, actually just now. Megan, do you want to turn over? We'll turn over to you to do your presentation first.
Absolutely. I love talking about housing, and I love having a captive audience. So let me bring up my PowerPoint. Sorry, I'm just trying to share my screen on the, do I have screen share permissions, Luis? Yes. Oh, it's the green button in front of me. Computer's just being a little slow. It's coming up. Okay. I don't want to belabor points that the city has discussed and council has discussed in some really incredible discussions that happened throughout 2024. What I would like to do in my role here today is discussing the talking points about the city's history and longstanding commitment to fair housing principles, and to reset the conversation about zoning and housing into looking at what our values are as a city and how we incorporate and bring them into our housing and zoning policies under the city's jurisdiction. As I introduced myself, we're a private nonprofit that serves predominantly the city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, as well as Western Pennsylvania and areas of Pennsylvania underserved by fair housing organizations. We've done a lot of municipal fair housing cases and activities and meetings over the past few years. Zoning is a hot topic statewide across the Commonwealth. So there's 3 key points I want to make this afternoon. One is I want to start with, everyone here knows what the Fair Housing Act is, we understand the concept, but I want to underscore that fair housing as a concept of fairness is a long-standing city of Pittsburgh value, not just in legislation, but in the concept of both what you as council members have voted on in the past and what your forebears as council members have voted on in the past. And so to that extent, I just want you to know in your bones that within the city of Pittsburgh, that we created the Fair Housing Act in 1959, 9 years before the federal government did, before Congress, before the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Pittsburgh was first, and Pittsburgh said fair housing is important to Pittsburgh. And then in 1969, when we added sex as a protected class, that happened 5 years before the 1974 amendment to the Fair Housing Act happened at the federal Congress. And then again in 1980, we added disability, and that was 8 years before an incredible amount of disability movements happened across this country, including Deaf President Now at Gallaudet in Washington, D.C. in 1988. And Pittsburgh was first. Pittsburgh said disability is a protected class, is a value that we have in the city. And so again, and a couple more data points on that, is that in 1990, we added sexual orientation. And then in 2014, Modern City Council, led by Councilman Bruce Cross at the time, added gender expression, gender identity, and technically we moved sexual orientation out of sex as a protected class. And that is critical today in 2025 as HUD has rolled back its LGBTQ protections. There is not only legislation, but capacity through the Commission on Human Relations to do enforcement when cases rise to that level to ensure that constituents have their fair housing protections actually helping them throughout our city neighborhoods and housing. And this is a long-standing Pittsburgh value. In 2020, Council added preferred language and citizenship status as a protected class. We have seen this being rescinded federally in terms of requirements for language access and housing. And then in 2023, many of you here at the table unanimously passed expanding the protections for survivors of domestic violence to allow survivors to flee their housing when they're fleeing violence. And so they don't have to choose between their physical safety and a lease. And we're dealing with such cases right now where survivors have been physically harmed, and the part that we as a city can protect them is by saying that we can ensure that they're in a safe housing environment because of what this body has done. And I would be remiss in the history of fair housing in the city of Pittsburgh if I didn't raise the 1992 Nalco case. If you haven't heard Nalco, it is the milestone case inside the city of Pittsburgh that most Pittsburghers have never heard of, where the city's Commission on Human Relations did a phenomenal job of a commission-initiated complaint, investigated it. It became a class action lawsuit with the highest settlement of any fair housing case in the history of Pennsylvania at the time, where the case was based solely on race discrimination, where the investigation by the city of Pittsburgh showed that a private company, and this is a quote from the whistleblower article, I can share the article with you, is that I'm sure you've seen it, these dots, and when the word call is circled, that's a Black person and we don't rent to them, was the basis of that investigation. And so I say all of this before you now simply to underscore that the values and ideals of what fair housing means, regardless of a bevy of different regulations, myriad of different legalities that are happening across the country, to ground our zoning discussions into facts and objective statements, and to remove hyperbole, so that way we can solve complex issues with difficult conversations that are based on our values as a city. So I want to make two more points, if you'll bear with me. You understand, everyone at this table, that the history of zoning in the city actually comes from intentional segregation, where we created zoning in order to openly discriminate based on race and national origin and religion and disability and more. And by happenstance, and I promise you this is not a prop, I keep it in my bag, is the 1923 Pittsburgh City zoning that I review as I can, because these issues are so complex that when I have a spare minute, I'm reviewing different provisions, trying to understand what the intent of City Council was in 1923 and what it is that we need to do today in order to maintain the values that we have, not just at this council, but at the council of all those who came before you. And so I also want to remind you, and these are two things that we're dealing with in the city of Pittsburgh in housing. There's zoning, and then under zoning, there's discrimination, but then there's also zoning was created out of the Industrial Revolution because unfettered development was creating unsafe living conditions. Renters in tenement housings were being sick and killed because of incredibly unsafe, because of fires that still plague us today. And so there's the duality of zoning where we're identifying use and what the use of the properties are for. And we're also looking at what it means for habitability and safety to make sure that Pittsburghers are in housing that is fundamentally safe for a human being to live in. And only in the past week or so, we had a roof collapse in the south side. And so the age of our housing stock is so incredibly old that safety in our housing stock is predominant. And I'm going to review that in a minute. So I want to touch on specifics of those 2 points specific to Pittsburgh, because this is our home. This isn't a national conversation for Pittsburgh. This is about our home. And so on the discrimination side, Pittsburgh today is one of the least diverse cities in the United States. And I'll explain this data point. I'm using a specific data point. We can use other data points, and no matter how you slice it in all sorts of different ways, this is a consistent truth, although the numbers may shift a little bit. So if you look at this chart, Pittsburgh, this is the Pittsburgh Metropolitan Statistical Area, so you understand it's the city of Pittsburgh and 7 southwestern PA counties. Urban metros are how we typically look at population. Pittsburgh has a metro of over 2 million people, but the amount of the overwhelmingly white population that we have as a city is more consistent with the metro area that has 168,000 people, 265,000 people. We are the largest city of our size to be as least diverse as we are. This is just a fact about, there's no specific thing to do that'll solve it immediately, but it's just a fact of understanding what it is that we're trying to address. And so I can send you the article that makes this data point, but basically what it's saying is that about 1 in 4 metro areas in the United States are less diverse than the average rural area. Pittsburgh is the largest of those metros that are less diverse than the rural average. And so San Jose, Texas, for example, is similar in size in terms of its metro area, but it is still more diverse than the city of Pittsburgh is. And so just in terms of, forgive my typos, and so in the city of Pittsburgh, our metro area is about 84.9% white, and the average rural area is about 83.5% white. So we're more consistent with rural areas when it comes to the diversity of people who live here. And so the point that we all here understand is that Pittsburgh needs people. We need to build our population. We need to attract new populations, quite frankly. And in order to do that, we both need the housing stock to do it, and we need welcoming, and we need the ability to bring in new people who feel welcome to be here. And it's complex, and it takes ongoing conversation and intentionality that you all have in order to solve these very difficult questions. And I also want to touch on disability, because when the city created the zoning in 1923, where did disabled people live in 1923? They lived in institutions. Pennsylvania's psychiatric hospitals only began closing in the 2000s, 2010 or 2008 is when Mayview, which serves Pittsburgh area, closed. And one of the things we are still addressing in our homeless and unhoused population is a large fact that we are still finding ways to integrate people who otherwise in a previous era in Pittsburgh would have been institutionalized at Mayview, are finding ways to get stable, affordable housing that's integrated in all our communities. Because what fair housing is about all of our neighbors having a choice to live within any of the neighborhoods that we have in the city. That is the fair housing goal. And quite frankly, just to share, is that if I had been born in a different era, I would have been in Mayview. I wouldn't be a professional today. It's the disability access and provisions that had given me this opportunity because of overwhelmingly what we went through as a country with institutionalizing disabled people, and we're still finding very complex problems that require our time and attention in order to find ways to integrate people with disabilities safely and affordably into all of our city neighborhoods. So I don't want to leave with just a problem. I want to propose ideas and conversations we can have to find solutions. I'm not saying these are the solutions, I'm saying these are examples. And so what we want to start with is we want to start removing the subjective language in our zoning. We want to start removing feelings and put objective and measurable standards in how we consider our zoning. So for example, this example is using housing for people with disabilities or group housing. And so we look at the use of how that housing works. So we're not looking at the fact that they're disabled, but we're looking at saying, are you assigned a bedroom? Are you living there? Are you receiving mail there? Are you having a permanent place for sleeping or a bedroom? And permanent in this definition is about 6 months minimum. Because a 6-month minimum in our own family unit, one of us could move out because of a semester of college, or we transferred to a different university, we changed jobs, or I'm going overseas for a work or educational opportunity, or an internship. And then we look at a more transitional timeline when we're looking at the amount of time in which people live there, because our residential neighborhoods are about living there. I belong there because I live there. And then we can consider different provisions for the characteristic of when a person has an assigned bedroom, but their average stay would be less than 6 months. And then you look at the separate category of emergency shelters, where I'm not being assigned a bed. I'm not being assigned a place that's mine, where I sleep, where I receive mail on an ongoing basis, and that is constantly changing. So then we start looking at, well, do these objective and measurable characteristics, are they consistent with this type of residential zoning? Where if you take an emergency shelter example, it's more akin to a hotel or a motel space, where you're having a change of the place where a person is assigned to sleep on a regular basis. You don't receive mail there, you don't live there, but it's very short-term in its nature. And also what we're dealing with, and I'm so proud of the city for addressing this, the other side of zoning is to address habitability, code enforcement, the use of those properties as we move forward after development or creation. And so what we need to start doing within our zoning discussions is tying those discussions to what enforcement agency is responsible or overseeing the habitability and code enforcement of that property. Is it the PLI's new rental registry? Is it the Allegheny County Health Department? Group homes for people in recovery have a voluntary license by the PA Department of Drug and Alcohol Programs that does a house inspection. There's a whole bevy of things that we need to untangle the Gordian knot and identify what applies to different aspects of zoning so we can address concerns and address constituents on the right place to go if there are tangible concerns in the use of the property upon the residents moving in. Now, bear with me, let me give you one last example, and I will stop, is that there is a remarkable discussion that happened in Denver last year. And we've been talking about so many different zoning discussions that the different bills have gotten a bit muddled. But this specific example that occurred in Denver was about accessory dwelling units. And what happened was the legislation created a maximum in which your square footage or your building footage can be. And the specific ADU that a resident wanted to build was above an existing garage. But the ADU was going to be for their mother who was disabled. And so they needed to ask the municipality a change to the rules or reasonable accommodation in order to widen or increase the footprint of the ADU in order for it to be large enough for the stair lift to serve a wheelchair user and for the unit itself to have enough clear floor space for a wheelchair user to live there. And what happened, and there's a really remarkable HUD outcome that you can read if you love the bureaucracy of this process, is that we want to enshrine in our legislation fair housing considerations like this, where zoning understands that a disability-based request is not to be treated as the same as any variance request. A disability-based request, especially in how old our housing stock is inherently inaccessible. And what we actually need to do is embed these fair housing principles in the practice of how the zoning will play out as it moves forward, and how the zoning board will hear and understand that access for a wheelchair user is different than a standard request because it's preferable for someone. And then there's a really neat, if I can send you the letter that HUD wrote, it's a remarkable investigation. And then here is the floor area and the floor plans that were showing the need for the increased square footage. So I thank you all for your forbearance. I've been told that listening to me talk about fair housing is like listening to a fire hose. I tried to edit this down, and I'm really, really glad for the work that council has put into housing, and I hope really hard with what's happening right now in the world that we'll continue to put our Pittsburgh city values first and foremost as we continue this discussion in 2025. And thank you,
Thank you.
Councilmember.
No, thank you. And we're also joined, I should mention, by Councilwoman Gross and Councilman Bobby Wilson. And we have Dan Friesen online if anybody has any questions. And so I just really want to say the reason I called for this was because there is so much discussion on zoning, and I want to understand myself all the different impacts and possibilities of what the zoning could. We've heard so many different versions of what can happen, what might not happen, what we need to do, and it's a lot all at one time with inclusionary zoning, transit-oriented development zoning, the group housing, all the different things we're hearing about. And so I'm trying to understand so I know how to tell my residents to be supportive, to not be supportive, to be open. And so I also asked Jonathan Kamen to be here, but he's not here today. I just found out, and I apologize for that, that he was unable to make it. So if you, maybe you or Dan Friesen could go over some of the different types of zoning and then I'll talk to Dan. Everybody can talk about what we think next.
Good afternoon, members. Sean Carter, Legislative Projects Manager, City Council. I'm just going to give a brief listing of all of the bills that have been introduced over, I'd say, the last 18 months. And we have to go back to 2023. In November, Councilwoman Gross and Councilman Coghill introduced their first version of temporary managed communities because we had they're trying to address the needs of the unhoused and the problems that they're seeing in the city. And then moving into 2024, Councilwoman Gross and Councilman Coghill were working for a long time with the Department of City Planning and the Planning Commission to sort of incorporate temporary managed communities into a sort of larger framework. But before that could happen, Councilwoman Cale Smith introduced her legislation which would change the regulations for community homes, so group homes in the city, group homes of more than 8 people in the city of Pittsburgh. And then shortly after that, the Department of City Planning introduced at the Planning Commission their Fair Housing Amendments, which attempted to incorporate temporary managed communities into a new use called interim housing, and made a host of other changes to the zoning code to, as the Department of City Planning explains, to make housing policy more fair in the city. Both of those bills are now indefinitely being held. They conflicted with each other, so they're now both sitting on hold. Then later last year, so we'd go back to September, October, the Planning Commission introduced the Housing Needs Assessment package of legislation, which included inclusionary zoning, accessory dwelling units, reforms to parking, minimum lot sizes, and transit-oriented development. And, oh, sorry, you're right. And then TOD's a separate package, but, and interim housing was in that legislation. No, that was in fair housing, sorry. So that legislation was approved by the Planning Commission. It was submitted to City Council. It has not currently been introduced. Subsequently, transit-oriented development legislation appeared before the Planning Commission. They had a rather raucous public hearing. That legislation at the Planning Commission was held. It is now, our understanding is it's being held indefinitely at the Planning Commission. And I don't have any more information about that. But at the same time, then late last year, in City Council, interim housing was introduced as a standalone piece by Councilwoman Gross and Councilman Coghill. And then Councilman Charlin introduced his own version of inclusionary zoning. Both of those bills are now on hold. And so that now takes us into 2025, where minimum lot sizes, which was a piece of the Housing Needs Assessment package, has been introduced as a standalone piece of legislation. And subsequently, there's an entertainment district zoning bill also working its way through City Council, in addition to a number of other zone change petitions for various properties in various neighborhoods in the city, which is normal. There just seems to be a lot of zoning legislation right now, more than most of us have seen at one time in a while. And so you've got all of these legislations, some of them conflict, some of them overlap. It's understanding that it's confusing to a lot of the public because we're constantly looking at bills and we're like, well, why is this here? Wasn't that there? And so those are all the bills currently, and I may have missed a couple. But those are the bills basically that are before council and or the Planning Commission in one form or another, in one status or another. And if I can answer basic questions about those if you have them. And so that's all I have for now.
We'll get to that in a minute. And Solicitor or Dan Friesen, you're online. Did you want to add anything?
I don't really have too much to add other than what Mr. Carter had said. I would note that zoning law is primarily about balancing various property owners' interests. That it is part of the history of America that people felt they had a right or an interest in being racist is a true statement, but that is not the primary purpose of the zoning code. It's so that if you bought a house, you have some say and some notice about what goes in next door to you. End of story. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. And I have some questions, so stay on in a minute. I'm going to turn it over to members. Does anybody have any questions or anything you want to add? No questions? So then I'm going to ask if you can give us some kind of breakdown with the transit-oriented development. A lot of residents in Sheridan were really angry when they had that presented to them. They're afraid that it's going to be only affordable housing and that there's nothing in Sheridan or for Sheridan. They're not getting a grocery store out of it. I think it was the way it was presented. But what all could it include for transit-oriented development other than housing? Is there anything else? Sean, do you want to answer that?
Well, I'm not prepared to speak to specifics on transit-oriented development today, but generally, in the neighborhoods where it is planned so Allentown at the South Hills Junction, Polish Hill in the vicinity of the Heron Avenue busway station, and Sheridan at the West Busway stop across from Langley High School, it's an increase in density, what they call upzoning, to allow for more diverse housing and other types of use types. That's about the best explanation I can give of it right now.
So I'll be honest with you, when it was presented to the community, they were really angry about it because they felt like, here we go again, more housing in Sheridan, more affordable housing in Sheridan, and no real investment in Sheridan. They don't see that investment. But I think had they presented and said, when they presented it to the community, we could also add in a grocery store. We could also add in the things that the community wants. Then worked with you on that. I think there would be less tension, but I think it's the way it was presented, and so I just want the community to realize that not all of it, but I want to make sure not all of it has to include affordability or anything like that. Do you want to talk about? Do you want to?
Well, what I will say before I hand it over to Megan is it's one of the hallmarks of transit-oriented development to put people near large transit nodes. It's more efficient. It's better for transit. The more people you put near transit, the more sustainable transit is, and that's why in most of the transit, you look at what they're doing in East Liberty and what they're looking in Larimer. A lot of it is trying to put as many people near the large transit hubs as possible. It's for the benefit of the people, and when you get that density there, then you make it possible economically to do the things like put grocery stores there and to put other high-end or high-intensity retail uses there. Okay. Again, these things have to be tailored for the neighborhoods they're going in, but...
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of the problem. No one's talking to the residents. They're coming in and talking at them and not to them, and engaging them in conversation. Sort of what Tammy was just saying about housing, for the Housing Authority, that we need to engage more of the public. Same goes for development, for zoning. And group homes, could you talk a little bit about the differences between all the different, the housing that Councilwoman Gross and Councilman Coghill introduced, the group homes, any type of different housing? Could you talk about that? Either of you talk about that?
I'm going to defer to Megan.
Yeah.
Let me, circle back on the discussion on transit-oriented development to reiterate that a long-standing fair housing principle is that you want diversity of income types across any neighborhood. And when you have existing affordable housing, you want to focus on increasing the amenities of grocery stores and libraries and ways that bring people into the area and neighborhood in order to then create an economy and that people are coming into the neighborhood and spending money. And we can look at the East Liberty transition of a multi-year discussion, very nuanced discussion of the Home Depot actually became before the Whole Foods. And so the initial focus being on certain areas, being on looking at businesses and amenities to help increase the money that's happening within the economy of that individual neighborhood. Regarding group homes is, I want to touch on is that I won't belabor the fact of all the multiple existing pieces of legislation that are out there. It's all very confusing for all of us. And what I hope that we can do in Pittsburgh is reset the conversation a bit into focusing on what are we trying to accomplish? How do we create integrated and safe and affordable housing for people with disabilities, with the historical concept of understanding of people being long displaced from Mayview and other considerations, and how do we understand what the characteristics and use, how long do people live there? Do they function as a family unit or as a boarding house or sort of an apartment type setting? And to start making decisions and definitions and concepts based on understanding these measurables and objective criteria of how any given group housing unit, whether someone is simply transitioning out of homelessness or if it is an intentional group housing for people with disabilities, such as people in recovery. And there's different partnerships that can be had with the Pennsylvania Department of Drugs and Alcohol programs that have introduced a voluntary licensing service. And so because of the number of things out there, I can talk for a while, but interested in council's interest or certain things we can focus on and then build off of. For example, right now, a group home is allowed by right for up to 8 people. And so we can look at how do these considerations with how we're looking at short-term rentals without people with disabilities, just short-term rentals, how it compares to the group housing legislation. And then combine that with how the ongoing onboarding of PLI's rental registry is addressing code enforcement concerns, is addressing habitability and use issues that could arise, after residents move in. So if anyone has specific questions, I'm happy to troubleshoot. And I think that one thing that we can look at in the city's current definition of family, just as an example, is that it actually allows for up to 8 people in a group home for people with disabilities who are living in a family setting. And then it has a different definition as is allowable for people who are not related by blood, marriage, or adoption. So that specific definition is currently limiting the housing for our students and others who are not related by blood, marriage, for adoption for living in a group of more than, I think it's 3, but I haven't looked it up today, in a 5-bedroom house, and you're constrained by an artificiality of how the existing law works. So unpacking the complexity of it to make sure we understand it and so the community can give us feedback so we all understand what it is that we're talking about. And one last point is to differentiate between housing where people are going to live and housing that is emergency shelter type housing. Those are 2 fundamentally different housing uses that should be governed with different criteria and principles. And if we start understanding what we're trying to accomplish, then we can build out language that I believe we all would have consensus for, because we're all really on the same side.
Thank you. And I think for me, one of the concerns I had was Christy Porter has a facility in Sheridan. It holds about 100 disabled people. And she was told that the transit-oriented development was going to include her property, which is not connected to the busway. It was going to include her property. Then the mayor called and told her no, it wasn't. Then she got a letter saying yes, it was, that it would be included. So I think it's the confusion in the lack of communication, or the collaboration of communication that's causing a lot of, angst. And I think that, and I want to know if it would include transit-oriented development, how would that affect a home like that, like Christy Porter's? Do you know that answer?
Not without reviewing the ordinance and seeing where that property fit and where the zone changes were, because even within transit-oriented development, in those zones, there are going to be different zoning districts. So it's going to have different regulations depending on the type of property, its proximity to the busway, and a whole host of other factors. So without reviewing that and looking at that property, it's difficult to give you that answer.
Yes, because actually her attorney called me and asked me, I don't think I'm the one to advise on this one. I'm trying to learn myself what, all the differences are and what the impact they'll have or possibly could have. And IZ zoning, we've heard so much about this. Could anybody talk about IZ zoning? And we've heard from developers that it's going to cause a delay in development, that it will actually have a negative impact on affordability, but we also hear that that's not necessarily the case. So can anybody feel comfortable talking about that?
To circle back to transit-oriented development for 1 second, is in the point of collaboration and communication and addressing residents' concerns is we should also be bringing the decision makers regarding transit to the table in those discussions. And so if we're going to make improvements or planned improvement on the busway, or if DOMI is having activities regarding right-of-way and street safety, and all of these different zoning discussions have intersections with other city departments. And so I think what's critical in 2025 is to bring the relevant departments to the table about all of those individual legislation pieces, and that will really address these concerns as we look at the totality of development includes. Regarding inclusionary zoning, let me say neither in pro or against any individual conversation that's happening out there. In full disclosure, I myself am a product of inclusionary zoning from Montgomery County, Maryland. My parents went to Gallaudet University, which is a university for the deaf and hard of hearing in DC. And after the fact, my mom became a single mother with a disability with 4 children and fleeing domestic violence. And we moved from Frederick, Maryland, that didn't have inclusionary zoning, to Montgomery County, Maryland, that because of inclusionary zoning that was available at that time in that neighborhood and those units, that I had access to one of the best public school systems in Maryland, which has arguably put me on my trajectory to be a working professional today. But I don't say that for or against any specific item as council discusses it. I say it for the intent of this council, which I know exists, of finding ways, whatever that solution is in inclusionary zoning and ADUs and minimum lot sizes, of creating housing units and opportunities for all different income types, for all of Pittsburgh to be able to live in Pittsburgh and in any of our neighborhoods, that a low-income family could choose to live into a unit they can afford in some way in Squirrel Hill, in Shadyside, in Highland Park, and there is a diversity in the socioeconomic fabric of all of our neighborhoods, and that means in some cases addressing neighborhood amenities like libraries and grocery stores and shops, and other places adding affordable housing. So we don't have the time to dive into the specifics, but I want us to have a discussion that's intentional about how do we create a diversity of housing in the city that serves all Pittsburghers, because that's what our value is, and recognizing that there's nuance to addressing different protected classes and different groups due to historical actions that have happened unrelated to any of us here, but what it is that we're tackling with in 2025 regarding segregation, regarding housing that's not accessible for people with disabilities, a huge number of conversations to be had.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. That's it for me.
Councilwoman, I can speak
yes.
a little bit on that.
Yes, please. You have a question?
When it comes to inclusionary zoning, I believe the law department of the city of Pittsburgh wrote a legal opinion in 2017, authored by Rachel O'Neill, who now sits on the planning commission, which clearly laid out the state of the law in Pennsylvania, which favors property owners. If we want a Pittsburgh for all, that should include property owners. And currently, the state of the law in Pennsylvania is that mandatory inclusionary zoning is unconstitutional and arises to a taking of someone's property without providing incentives. So the key is for a legal pathway to inclusionary zoning in the city of Pittsburgh would be to provide incentives, offsets, and other options for property owners who want to participate in inclusionary zoning.
I have a question.
To force it on property owners is to take their property, and you'll have to compensate them for it.
Okay, thank you, Councilman Wilson.
Yeah, I just had a general thought about, in terms of neighborhoods and investing in neighborhoods. We have an own PGH program, right? That's the program where home closing costs were given. I think we allocated several $1 million to 150 individuals or couples, families, however you break it down. And so we're having people buy into the idea of having people buy into the idea of they should be homeowners and they should, build wealth that way. And the public is assisting in that. And so, as someone who's really eager to get the land bank moving, I think that's even more critical now since we've just invested in this whole, this whole idea that people, which I agree with, but just the fact there's a lot of public money going into that, we should make sure that they are able to build wealth and that we are, solving the vacant abandoned property issue in Pittsburgh. And, I know that's not specific to zoning, but a lot of these zoning changes are trying to, grow Pittsburgh in a way that's for, that's going to be for a lot of people. And I think that's a big missing link, that although we have funds for the land bank until 2026 that we can use, after that, we're back at the drawing board. I'm trying not to get back at the drawing board in 2026. That's why I'm talking about this now, and meeting with and like-minded individuals that want to see the land bank working. But I think that the land bank is just in its infancy, and when we put out millions of dollars for a program to say to people you should be homeowners, that really what we're saying, we don't want to. I also don't want to say that then we're just going to leave you behind. Like, we need to, where those homes are, we need to identify vacant abandoned property and move that along. But I think that's a really scary conversation for some people, because they, this whole idea of taking land and renewing land, even though we get it back in the tax rolls, it's always, it's always a sticky topic. The URA will put up for sale signs, on different properties that they were going to sell, and they came down because, the public, there was some public outcry on that wasn't the right process. So, the land bank has to figure out the appropriate process so that we can at least be partners with neighborhoods in the community. But I mean, ultimately, that's where we're really lacking, is just some greater vision in terms of growth just in our own neighborhoods.
Well, I can tell you, speaking of Own PGH, which is a program where the city, between the city and the URA, they're helping cover the closing costs. I believe it's up to $90,000 to help families get into basically starter homes so they can stay in the city. But if we go back 14 years, prior to Tom Corbett becoming governor, the URA and the Housing Authority used to collaborate to essentially build brand new houses. And between the Section 8 home ownership program and funds that the URA received from PHFA, which they then put into the Pittsburgh Housing Development Corporation, which is an affiliate of the URA, they would build brand new homes at cost and basically write down all but $45,000 to $50,000 of it between the subsidies available from the Housing Authority and PHFA. And low to moderate income families would then only need to get a mortgage for $45,000, $50,000, which they were then able to get because of the value of the house being written down by all of this subsidy. And they were putting families into houses, which it's a shame that program in that format went away, because that was a really useful way to get low and moderate income families into housing in neighborhoods where they could permanently invest. And so Own PGH is sort of a variation of that. But with the cost of housing today, even helping a couple or a person with $90,000 isn't the same as paying $200 of the $250,000. That's 14 years ago. Now I guess we'd have to pay like $350 of $400,000 now, just given the increase in materials and supplies. But if the money were there to do that, if the state would go back to making those kinds of investments, those are things that the city could do in much larger numbers, because the city simply just doesn't have money to do that.
I can piggyback. Homeownership is absolutely a conversation that needs to be a part of this. And Own PGH was a remarkable program that I believe is not currently accepting applications due to a lack of funding. And I'll share is that I lived in subsidized housing from first grade until my junior year. My mom moved out and bought a house that she lives in today because of closing cost assistance. One of the closing cost assistance issues that we could need to address and can continue to work on in the city is that in order for closing cost assistance to be effective, you have to qualify for a mortgage in the first place. And we have an incredible racial disparity in homeownership for a host of different reasons. And so one of the conversations we can have with the mortgage providers in the region is a consideration of what's called special purpose credit programs that restructures how you do your risk assessment on the loan, including for land bank properties, to make sure that those properties are being sold to the AMI that's targeted to create demographic diversity in the housing market, including through home ownership.
that it? Okay, thank you. Councilwoman Warwick?
Yeah, thanks. So, this sort of feels like kind of an informal discussion. So I guess I'm just gonna, I mean, questions. So when I came on council just over 2 years ago, right out of the gate, the pro-development community was screaming for zoning reform. With good reason, right? Making lots of very, very compelling arguments about why we need to reform our zoning code, right? Why the zoning code that we have makes it hard to build, even build structures next to, like, you know, build an apartment building next to an apartment building, you know, like it wasn't allowed, all kinds of things. There was a, you know, like you used to be able to build it, now you can't, right? So there was this, and continues to be this large outcry for fast zoning reform. They wanted to see it quickly. So there was that. There was also the housing needs assessment, which was done prior to when I arrived on council, but which clearly showed a desperate need in the city for affordable housing, right? Because people are being priced out, and we heard Megan talk about, you know, and the lack of diversity and the segregation in this city is just being exacerbated by the increase in housing costs and people being pushed out of the city because of rising housing costs. And then also we had, because of the pandemic and these rising housing costs, this crisis of homelessness that we are experiencing across the country and also here in Pittsburgh, right? So there's sort of like these three, at least this is my experience. I'm just speaking from my perspective. There are these three large, needs being expressed, at least to me, on council. So, and this is my understanding of all these bills. We talked about all of this huge number of bills. So, in response to the crisis of homelessness, you had Councilwoman Gross and Councilman Coghill who wanted something faster than we were getting, right? So they introduced this temporary managed communities bill, right? And then the administration, and perhaps because of that bill, maybe that bill sort of lit a fire that needed to be lit, introduced the fair housing package, and that temporary managed communities bill was sort of included in that package. There were some community concerns around that package, and we can argue as well that the rollout was not, certainly to council members, was not perhaps clear enough about what that package included. And so there was a competing bill that came from Councilwoman Smith over a very specific point around the larger community homes. So that's how those two are kind of held up.
I just want to add a point of clarity.
Yeah.
It wasn't a competing bill. I didn't know about their bill.
Oh, okay. Well,
Okay.
at any rate, but a bill that in effect is
Yeah.
competing because it, right? And then because of that conflict, right, Councilwoman Gross and maybe Councilman Coghill, I'm not sure, then pulled out the interim housing piece, again, which addresses what they were wanting to address at the beginning, so pulled that out and introduced as a separate bill in order to address this, this issue of what to do with folks sleeping in tents on the street. Then, and now I want to go back to the pro-development community that was screaming for zoning reform. The day I took office, screaming at my desk, and they had a list of things that they wanted to make it easier to build housing, make it more profitable to build housing, And among other things, was lot size reform and the elimination of parking minimums, right? So a number of council, and then there was also the ADU. And so a number of council members, Councilwoman Gross was working on the ADU, Councilwoman Strasburger was working on the parking minimums, and I was working on the lot size reform. And so we were working on these pieces, and the administration and Councilwoman Gross, who has inclusionary zoning in her district, said, look, this is what we want to do. We want to introduce this package that allows developers and, you know, and including these pro-development folks to build more, to build, build higher, build more units, eliminate the parking requirements so they can just build the parking that they need. Also allow, accessory dwelling units. And in exchange for that, we want buildings that are 20 units or more to include 10% of those units to be affordable to people at 50% AMI or less. So that would be people who are making about $17 an hour or less. And here's what happened. And I'm going to talk about John Kamen, even though he's not here, because he represents a lot of these developers who are coming and saying, IZ can't be done. We can't do it. Even though we were creating incentives, right?
I'm just going to say, since he's not here, please just refer to him as the attorney for developers or something. He's not here to
because
defend
I think it's
himself.
important.
I'm going to say, since he's not here to defend himself, just refer to him as the attorney for
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
But that this attorney represents Walnut Capital, represented LG Realty in the Penn Plaza development that displaced a large number of folks from East Liberty. That's sort of an infamous situation. Represents Rugby Realty, represented the owners of the Roosevelt building when they were evicting their tenants from affordable housing downtown. Also has represented Lamar in a fight with the city over the billboard tax. Has represented, just recent, or in 2021, represented a client family house to actually block a 10-story residential development that would have been 300 units in Oakland, right? So that's actually blocking housing. And just recently, this past October, was representing a client in front of the Planning Commission for an 8-story building conversion. So what I would say...
They also represent the City of Bridges Community Land Trust.
Okay, all right. But what I would
Okay.
say, my point being
I'll give you a chance to say something.
that as an attorney, this person represents the interests of their clients, whoever those clients may be, and not the interests of the people of the city of Pittsburgh. Their duty, first and foremost, is to represent the interests, the financial interests and otherwise, of their clients. And it is our job as city council to represent the people of Pittsburgh. So I just want to say that. And so it is not surprising that when asked to participate in our inclusionary zoning, to have some skin in the game in managing our affordable housing crisis by giving a very modest 10% of their units, making them affordable, which they could do by accepting vouchers, that those clients are fighting tooth and nail, even though as a city council, as a body, not everybody, not every council member, but certainly a number of council members have been working for the past 2 years in very good faith to create an environment in which these developers can build more and can make more money, and that also includes the affordability that Pittsburghers need. Because the reality is that over the past 10 years, in Pittsburgh, we have seen in high amenity neighborhoods, and I know Councilman Wilson doesn't like this term, luxury housing, but the reality is that if it has a swimming pool, and it's very, and let me say that when you build housing, and because I've actually had these conversations, right? If the building of the building is the same, right? Putting in the granite countertops and the swimming pool and the gym, that costs nothing. But the result of doing those things is that you can charge exorbitant rents. And so that's why market rate house, and that is what, in my mind, constitutes a luxury building, right? Does it have a pool? Does it have a gym? Does it have all these nice little amenities in the building itself, right? So what we have seen, because what makes the most money is to build luxury housing. That is the business interest of the developer, right? So that's what we have seen. So all the building that we have seen by these market rate developers has been that type of building that people just simply can't afford. So my understanding of the housing needs assessment package is that go ahead and build those things, and we will make it easier. We will let you build more, let you build higher, encourage the building of those buildings around transit. But if we don't also have the inclusionary zoning that allows working families to live in those buildings, at least some of them, then all of that great housing around all those great amenities, whether the amenity be transit or grocery stores and all these things, are simply reserved for the wealthiest people among us. And that is sort of my understanding of the situation that we are in, and the laundry list of bills and holding things up, I think, is ironic because of the desperate screaming by the pro-development community about how quickly we needed this zoning reform. We must have it. But then as soon as we want something for the people, for working class people, all of a sudden, all these roadblocks are put up in the way. So I don't know if either of you want to comment on that. I realize that was just a monologue and not questions, but, you know.
I can speak to one of your points, and that's speaking about how long it takes to get a zoning bill from start to finish. I've been here a long time, and usually the more controversial or the more public interest there is in a zoning bill, the longer it takes to finish. In fact, the bill I've only seen one bill move from start to finish quickly, and that was last year when Councilman Wilson introduced, the Planning Commission approved, and then City Council approved in lightning speed his changes to single unit attached housing by making it a use by right and single unit detached zoning districts. I've never seen a bill move that fast. Aside from that, everything else takes months, years. I mean, we've got bills in front of council, we've got zoning bills in front of council right now that are 2 years old. They've just still been, it's just taken that long to work through all the differences. And so I understand the frustration with that. I think what we've seen over the last 8 months is an interesting confluence of bills that have a lot of public interest and council using its rules, which council typically does not do. But they always have the right to do it. It's just a question of when they choose to do it, and apparently, as we've seen, the havoc that can be created if they do. And I don't know how you get around that except, I guess a different set of conversations with the Planning Commission. As how these bills, initiate, because under the zoning code, there's only two entities that have the right to initiate a change to the zoning code, and that's the Planning Commission and City Council, and then ultimately City Council has to approve them all. And that's somewhere in that process, you're getting some of these breakdowns, and then these bills get back to council, and you're running into more breakdowns, and I don't know how to tell you to work through that other than, you're right, I have not seen this much. I haven't seen this many roadblocks on zoning bills in a long time. Usually they just take forever because, the Planning Commission has 90 days to consider a bill, and then City Council has 120 days to hold a hearing, and then another 90 days to finally decide it, and both sides have the right to extend those deadlines, and so these bills just take a long time. But these bills, admittedly, to your point, are taking an even longer time, and then the irreconcilable conflicts between her community homes bill and then the fair housing amendments have both of those bills on ice, and then the irreconcilable conflicts between the two versions of inclusionary zoning have both of those bills sitting, basically in a desk drawer. And these are things we've not seen. We have not, I can count on one hand the number of times we've seen an irreconcilable conflict between two versions of the same concept in almost 20 years. It's just not something that's normal.
I would argue that the reason for that, and it's unfortunate, and I get it, like, we are politicians and, this is politics, right? But I would really, I think it would be in the best interests of Pittsburghers if we would recognize that if and I can't force developers to recognize anything, right? But but if as a body we could make the folks who we are representing at the table understand that to operate in good faith is to reach a compromise and to come to the table and have a discussion. I'm not defending the administration or others, right? Like, this has not happened. To come to a compromise on these issues rather than throwing up competing things and blocking things or pulling things out, that we know, pulling out, and I know, Councilman Wilson, pulling out the lot size reform, which is the golden nugget that all the developers want absolutely so they can build more, and not, so that we can get that one passed without doing the inclusionary zoning. That just creates conflict on council. It politicizes the overall process in a way that it does not need to be. I understand we're in an election year, so all of this is like at a super high, but as a body, we would be doing our jobs better if we were able to kind of cut through all of that and sit down and have some honest conversations between ourselves, with the administration, and also, to be honest, with our constituents. And we will go back to the housing issue, because, having people come, I've had people come to me, I have residents who are like, say horrible things about their neighbors who are struggling with addiction or struggling with, and I get it, and it's not, it is frustrating to live next door to a landlord who is not holding up, who's not taking good care of their, and requiring their tenants to sort of, live in a neighborly way but we also need to be honest with our constituents too about the need to, and the need to house people and what that means to do it in an equitable and fair way across the city. So again, I guess I'll just, Megan, if you want to speak to that, yeah.
I just wanted to say briefly that I think of all the facts that are confusing all of us, one of the things that keeps getting conflated in these discussions is housing for people who are unhoused, what the concept of temporary managed communities and emergency shelter uses are, compared to transitional and permanent housing where people live. They have a dedicated unit or bedroom, and those are two very fundamental different uses of housing. And a lot of the resident feedback is really focused on the concept, and this is standard for metropolitans and cities nationwide and in Pennsylvania. In all of my experience, zoning will bring constituents to the table. When you have not had public comment before, suddenly it will exist in droves whenever zoning is discussed, and it happened with Councilman Wilson's bill. And it was a remarkable bill in the Housing Can Touch discussion of being surgical in addressing a specifically defined issue and having that intent behind every aspect of the language behind that bill. And so if we can start to put that back into our discussions as a city of, at least just starting with recognizing the role of temporarily managed communities recognizing the historical context that the chronically unhoused who are then evicted from housing that they're placed in due to behavioral matters is itself an extension of Mayview and the need for social services and other discussions and how those types of housing are run and what their role is, compared to housing that's permanent in some way, shape, or fashion where a person lives, and that the characteristics and the zoning that governs those two uses should be differentiated in the conversations we're having.
Thank you. Councilman Wilson?
Thanks. There's a few things that came to mind in the recent, like the topics of the package, the bill that came over as a package, and bringing up the attached housing bill. And let me just say that the attached housing bill came out of, a project that the city of Bridges was trying to do, struck down in court. They were given the variance, but then they were struck down because the neighbors fought it. And so, the zoning code was changed. They had to do that because the zoning code was changed, I don't know, back in the 90s, so that neighborhoods look more suburban, apparently. That's what they were going for. But there was always houses that were attached on these parcels, and so we just wanted to bring that back. So really it was just common sense legislation that I thought, and that's why maybe it went so quickly. But I think there's a lot of other common sense things that we want to do, and to try to attach every single thing that is so archaic and common sense to inclusionary zoning is just, it's just a very small, I want to say it's a small vision. It's a small way to realize what the potential is of, a real vision to make sure that there is affordable housing in Pittsburgh. And, because I say that because, like, if you're going to put together a real package, then you're going to look at permitting reform, you're going to look at stormwater reform, like, why our stormwater is now only being enforced in the past year, but it's been on the books for 3 years, and why at the time whenever, building costs are so high and all this, like all these other things are happening. So, people who own property or developers, I only think that they have their voice is like resonating with a lot of people because we see what's happening downtown with vacancy. We see that projects aren't coming off the ground easily. And so whenever, I heard comments, I think it was from, Councilman Warwick, that, we have to do what's best for Pittsburgh and not developers. I think, people who are trying to figure out, good zoning and also to do something good for Pittsburghers, what I've been talking about is trying to figure out how I can do right for my constituents. And I think we all want to do that. Like I talk about, making sure that if that city retaining wall needs fixed, we can do it. That landslide needs fixed, we can do it. If we could spend less money on our fleet, more money on our fleet so we can spend less in the future, like that's just, obvious things that we want to do. And why does this matter in terms of, the topic that we're all talking about? It's why am I bringing this up? Well, it's because, we have to have people invest in Pittsburgh. And, we're not currently doing that at the level we could. We're the biggest property owner in Pittsburgh. And so, we could be much better at managing our property so that there could be more affordable opportunities. I think we could look inside ourselves a lot more than we could criticize others. And I think that there's a moment here where, we shouldn't just take this current IZ that's been written and think that this is like, this is the golden nugget for people who need affordable housing. I think that, the current IZ bill that's on the that it isn't on the table, but it was sent over to planning by the administration. It's not like some of the other, it doesn't have incentives that, would actually make some of these projects pencil out. So I think it's a much larger discussion, and quite frankly, it was just, sent over to planning in this package of bills that, I'm not sure how, it was calculated that this would be the package that worked, but, I'm not sure how some of this stuff relates to each other, because the parking issue is developers and banks are going to want to fund projects where they need parking or don't need parking. So that's just, I'm not sure why that's even being discussed. That's a whole separate issue, and there'll be a lot of neighborhoods who, take some issue as to why some places wouldn't, build spots because they're going to complain about parking outside their house. I don't know. Those are just all different subjects, but I'm curious to know, like in Montgomery County, like you said, there's inclusionary zoning. Is that, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with the bill that was written, but is that similar to the bill that was written, or are there different incentives?
So I really enjoy these discussions, and I appreciate a few points that you made. And to go back to the legislation regarding housing touching, and the idea that the basic confusion with Pittsburgh zoning that we all agree on is that if a house burns down tomorrow, you cannot by right rebuild that exact house on that parcel because of zoning changes that have happened, even though it would be 100% the same property that currently exists there. And why I studied the litigation that happened on that case that resulted in that ordinance, and the current litigation that's happening, where one of the issues, because of how archaic our overall zoning is right now, is that the zoning commission or the planning commission approves it, and then someone litigates it. And there's incredibly subjective language in our current zoning code that allows a person to make an assertion that says, this will harm me. They don't have to define it, they don't have to measure it, they don't have to prove it. They just, using the language of zoning now, say in court to the judge that I don't like it and it will hurt me, and say how it will hurt them somehow, and just assert it. And they're able to prevail in court and have the city zoning decisions turned down or city planning decisions turned down. So if we start revisiting the zoning discussion with that kind of subjective language and addressing if we can create zoning definitions and concepts of what is allowable by right and special exception on any individual zone and parcel, and also protect the city against that when we make that this decision within the context of what we created, that there isn't some loophole that allows any person to have that decision overturned at a later date.
I apologize, but I do have to get going, but I just wanted to, make those points. I appreciate your comments. I just want to make the point that, to do the best for Pittsburghers, I think it's a, two-sided conversation, because we want to make sure that we are passing bills where there is going to be continued growth, because we all know that without tax revenue, which we're losing tax revenue downtown at a at an ongoing, it's just ongoing. We actually don't know. I think the conversation is a much longer conversation than just do it type attitude. So I'm glad we're having this discussion, and thanks to
Thank you.
Councilwoman Smith.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just want to make a few
I'll
comments.
listen.
and
I'll listen after, but
I'm gonna turn it
I
back
try
to
to stay as long as I
Just
could.
real quick
Go
before
ahead.
Councilman leaves, it's funny because this is, sometimes it takes Councilwoman Smith to call a post agenda to have the kind of real discussions that we need to have, about this.
I think I say mostly this at the table.
What's that?
I say this mostly at the table.
No, I know, but I just mean, so that's the thing, and this is where where I get frustrated, right? Is with this housing needs assessment package and the fair housing package, is I'm not saying necessarily that there isn't room for compromise, but we aren't able to do it because it's been blocked.
Well, we're
Right,
not,
like,
we're not even
that's-
able to talk about the real thing, because the numbers that are being used, 50% MI, isn't what is needed in the housing needs assessment. It's 30% AMI and 120% AMI. So if we actually want to have a real discussion, we should talk about the facts and not just act like, the bill that's presented is the bill that's going to solve our housing needs issue. It's a Band-Aid that's
But
going to come off in the bath.
I don't think that anyone is saying that it's going to solve the issue. I think they're saying it's a piece of the puzzle. And
It's
but
all
we
a piece
can't.
of the puzzle, but
And so is the land bank, and so
Yeah.
right, and so is PLI reform, and so is, and all of these things, right? But when the development community, see, this is when the development community just is like not going to work, never going to work. It's hard to believe that.
we can't sell
Right.
buildings downtown if they give it away right now.
But I mean,
You
isn't
can't sell a building for $1. There's some buildings you can't even sell for $1 if you give it away.
But
Just-
that's
just
not the
can't.
case in other neighborhoods, right? And aren't we talking about removing downtown from the IZ requirement?
I think
So-
we should have it one at a time, but I do like the
Yeah.
conversation because I think it
I do have to
helps us,
go.
it helps us get to a place where we can come to a compromise. Thank you, Councilman Wilson, and thank you for engaging in the conversation. And I'm just gonna say for my part that, thank you so much. I do think that you and Councilman Wilson see a lot of things that you want to see changed, and somehow I think he sees what he wants as a connection to what you want, but you have to have the money to do the things you want. So I think in some ways he's seeing what you're and hearing what you're saying, and I don't want to speak for him, but I just think we should have this meeting and we should have conversations. And that has been my issue from the very beginning, is that there had not been real conversations. And talking to a few council members doesn't do it. You have to talk to council, as every one of us, and you have to understand that what might be good for the East End is not maybe necessarily what they want in the West End, or what is good for the West End, or good for the South Hills, or good for the North Side. Everybody represents an area because we know what our residents, for the majority, want, and that they trust us to do what's best for them. I don't see them mutually exclusive. I see that there's a way to make everything work together, but I think it's having these conversations. And I'm hoping that this, actually, some of the reasons I put my legislation forward was because I had heard all these things that were happening in my district without any conversation. And I actually had places where people had suggested that we do some of the things that were being presented for neighborhoods that were more open or more willing to accept some of the things that were being presented. But they weren't being considered. And I just thought that there needed to be some real conversation, and I wanted to put some protections in place for my district so that they do have a voice. And so that's how my legislation came about. I didn't know anything about the other legislation at the time. It wasn't competing. It's competing when you don't talk to council members and you're doing something in their district. So, you know what I mean? That goes both ways. It's a conversation that needs to happen. But in residents of the city of Pittsburgh, when we talk about Pittsburgh for all, it doesn't mean just people that are in need. It doesn't mean people that are just middle class. It doesn't mean people that are just wealthy. It means all of them together. And sometimes developers live in the city of Pittsburgh. I mean, I've met with two this week that live in Squirrel Hill, and I know I have some that live in my district. So we want to make sure their needs and their concerns are addressed. But hopefully we get to a point where we're meeting the needs of the residents that do need help, and that means the affordable housing. Councilwoman?
There's just to one point, because I think this is extremely important, and I'll let Megan address it, is that, while I understand the needs of different communities, right, and the desires of different neighborhoods to, have, it seems to me that for the sake of equity and fairness and diversity, both racial diversity and economic diversity in our city, when we are talking about whether it be affordable housing or housing for certain folks with disabilities, whatever that may be, we can't make, and this was one of my primary issues with Councilman Charlin's bill, not my only issue, but certainly one of my primary ones, is that you can't make rules where groups of people, because they live in one area or another, can say not here. You can't do that here. If we make rules about housing, period, right, about or or really anything, they have to be rules that apply. Now, I understand that there's zones in the city, right? There's R1s and R2s and multi-unit residential zones, like, based on the land and sort of the transportation and that type of thing. But creating rules, allowing communities to say housing rules need to apply to the whole city, right? We can't allow one community or another to say, no, I don't want that. I don't want that type of person, or I don't want that type of thing in my community, because then we would never have it in any community, right? And that's how you end up with the type of public housing that we have, right, in urban areas all across the country, right, is that you have pushed away in a pocket in an area, housing for poor people, ultimately, that then is and then those folks are not able to take advantage of the things in the neighborhoods where all the nice amenities are, and then it's the school districts, et cetera. And so that is, anyway, I'll leave it at that. I don't know if
So
Megan,
I just
you
want
have-
to say too that I hear what you're saying, but I do think residents have a right to say, how is that property going to be managed? How many people will be living there? Is there going to be staff on board? And when those conversations don't happen, that makes everybody so anxious. And I think that's what happened with some of the things in my, it's just kept happening. They were reading about it in the paper.
Sure.
And then that just made everything escalate and all the tensions rise. And now they're keenly aware of every single thing about zoning, more than we have ever been. And I think it's because, they would read about it and hear about it. And they just wanted to ask those questions at first. For some
And
of the
I
properties.
believe in community input, right?
Yeah,
And
I
I
do
don't
too.
actually, I don't like this term NIMBY that, the sort of pro-developer community loves to use, right? Ugh, these communities, they just want to slow it down. They all want to say, yes, communities want to say. They want to know what's going on. They want to know, but that doesn't mean, but the laws that we pass, right, I don't think should allow communities to sort of block this or that type of housing, right? There should be a process. People should have input, right? But when we ultimately, whatever the compromise is, whatever we come to, that those rules should apply to the whole city in an equal and fair way.
I think part of the problem has been that we have, such a struggle with PL&I. We have such a struggle with enforcement, and that people see that they call us and they don't see responses to things, and so they don't trust us to manage things. It's not necessarily about the people. A lot of people have some of the people in their own homes that need some of the housing and some of the services we're talking about. I mean, a lot of people do in Pittsburgh. Obviously, at this point, we're seeing that there's a large void here. And so I think that's not the question. The question is, how are we going to manage things? What does it mean in terms of parking and traffic? And, the details matter. And it's not necessarily related to the people, but the actual operations and management. And, in our district, we had just in, and you heard yesterday somebody from Housing Authority who said she managed, or who's going to be on the Board of Housing Authority, said she managed a property up there. It was like a nightmare for those people for years before we could finally get the place shut down. And the goal wasn't to shut down the place originally. The goal was to manage it right.
Right.
And so I think that's the conversation that needs to happen. Those kinds of conversations need to happen whenever you're talking about doing some of this type of projects or work in neighborhoods. I think Pittsburgh is a very caring city, and I think a lot of times our residents want to do things to help people. We step up to the plate a lot of times on national issues or local issues when people need stuff. But that doesn't mean that they're willing to sacrifice their peace and their safety without any kind of conversation. And I think that's the part. And they have to know the reality of, what does this housing actually mean? Can there be people with these types of issues, or, is our safety, or the registered sex offenders going to be here? Do I have to worry about my child? I think they want to know those things. They have a right to know those things, and they would be irresponsible not to know those, to try to find out those things for their kids. Yeah. So I think that's the conversation. I think mostly we just need to come together. I do agree there could be a compromise. I agree that we should be able to work together, but that means everyone together at the table. People in need of housing, people who actually help do supportive services, and I think it also means the developers and the administration and council to coming together to try to figure out what those solutions are. And I think if we really want to see something work together for all of Pittsburgh, that's what we do. Because both sides are using extreme insults and wording that's just offensive, and we're just become such a divisive not just city, but a country, obviously. But I think it's instead of us working together for the betterment of Pittsburgh, we're fighting against one another for politics or for whatever reason. And we really need to keep our eye focused on what is in the best interest of Pittsburgh as a whole. And so with that said, I hope that we do come together. I hope we work through some of this. Sean, wrapping it up, could you just tell me one more time all the current legislation and what has passed, what hasn't passed, or where it stands currently? And one of the things I'm interested in knowing is for the Councilwoman Gross and Councilman Coghill's legislation, does that affect my legislation at all? And I think Dan Friesen said it does in his opinion, and so in his legal opinion. So I want to know about that too, if there's any concerns there.
Okay. Well, going back to 2023, there was Councilwoman Gross and Councilman Coghill's original temporary managed communities legislation, which was to address a shortage of options for the unhoused.
I think that was from the Housing Task Force, right?
I believe that may have arisen from
the
the Housing Task Force, the council impaneled, maybe it was a year before that.
Right.
Or 18 months before that.
was a while ago.
Then in early 2024 came Councilman Wilson's amendment to the residential single unit detached zoning district to add residential single unit attached options as a use by right. So you could now build townhouses in the R1D, which you could not do before, at least not without a variance in a lawsuit. Then later in that summer, your community homes bill, which purported or attempted to further regulate group homes of more than 8 disabled persons citywide. 2 weeks later came the Planning Commission's Fair Housing Amendments, which made a whole host of changes to the zoning code for various things, both unhoused, occupancy limits, just a whole host of changes. Both of those are indefinitely held. Then later in
At the Planning Commission.
they're both locked up at the the Fair Housing Amendments bill is locked up here.
So
Her bill is locked
I do
up
want
at
to
the
be
Planning
clear, real
Commission.
clear
Got it.
first. We were not ever in violation of the fair housing laws. Is that correct?
No, I didn't see it as a matter of compliance, but as a matter of policy and decision-making. So we don't want to create discriminatory zoning that would
Right.
put us out of compliance.
Right.
But I've filed municipal cases, I filed zoning municipal cases, and I had hoped, I want the conversation to be about the city's support and longstanding history of fair housing,
Right.
and that it's not a situation where the zoning itself is out of compliance
Right.
with existing law.
I just want to be clear that we were never out of compliance, because I think a lot of people thought we were out of compliance and thought, how could we just not address this? But we weren't out of compliance, or we would have addressed it immediately. That's why I want to make sure. Okay. I'm sorry, Sean.
No, that's okay. And so after community homes got indefinitely held at the Planning Commission and fair housing amendments were blocked here, the Planning Commission introduced the Housing Needs Assessment Package, which included accessory dwelling units, amendments to parking requirements, changes to minimum lot size requirements, and inclusionary zoning. And it was given a positive recommendation after several different briefings at the Planning Commission, and then it simply was not introduced here at Council. It hasn't been blocked per se, but it certainly was not introduced. At the same time, last December, Councilman Charlin introduced a different version of inclusionary zoning, which created the irreconcilable conflict between the two versions of inclusionary zoning. And both of those bills are in the ether, so to speak. They haven't been formally blocked, but they're also not on the table at the moment. And then Councilwoman Gross and Councilman Coghill reintroduced as a standalone bill interim housing. So they pulled interim housing out of the blocked fair housing amendments and introduced it as a standalone.
But let me ask Dan Friesen. Now, does that conflict with my legislation?
We still
As
have
much as there was an attempt to make a distinction that they did not conflict because the Gross-Coghill bill was temporary and only for interim housing. The problem with that assertion is that the way it is written is that the use goes on in perpetuity. However, they can only operate 2 years at a time. There's something like that. It's like on for 2 years, off for a year. but nonetheless, it's still in perpetuity. So it's not a real distinction in terms of temporariness because it goes on in perpetuity. So with that in mind, if your bill governs the unhoused and their bill governs the unhoused, then yeah, those are the same subject matter. And via the Robert's Rules of Order, only one subject matter can be handled at a time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Sean, I'm sorry.
Sorry, can you go back to the housing needs assessment?
Yes.
So that one was positive recommendation.
That one received a positive recommendation from the Planning
Charlene
Commission.
bill got the negative recommendation.
Charlene's bill got a negative recommendation.
And where are they both now?
They're both here because Councilman Charlene's bill was a council bill. It's already in standing committees, and because the housing needs assessment was a Planning Commission bill, it must be introduced.
So we are waiting.
We are awaiting its introduction.
Got it. Okay.
But
You know, it
that
would be helpful to
aside,
have a chart of all this.
well,
Have it show us, like-
Councilwoman Strasburger does, and I think she just sent that to all
Oh,
members.
did she? Okay, good.
She does have a chart of all of these bills, where they are in the pipeline, and
Okay,
their
great.
current status.
That is great. She's amazing.
But then a couple of weeks ago, Councilman Wilson introduced, he pulled the minimum lot size portion out of the housing needs assessment, introduced it as a standalone bill. And the reason he chose to do that is because the housing needs assessment bill, although it came to council as a single bill, is in fact 4 separate bills. If you go on the City Planning Commission's website right now, you'll still find them as 4 separate bills that were stitched together for the purposes of introduction. But that violates the rules of council, which is why it wasn't introduced. I can't speak to how we got to minimum lot sizes as a standalone bill, but sure enough, we do, and it's on the table. It's been introduced, and it is now on hold pending a public hearing. And so that's
And that's where we are with the latest.
where
it.
we are today.
Okay.
Now, some of these things are changing,
Yeah.
so,
There's also
next week it could be different.
there's the transit-oriented development package.
Which has been,
Oh,
and there's transit-oriented development, which the Planning Commission has indefinitely held
At the planning commission.
at the Planning Commission.
You know, it would be helpful if maybe we put this on the website so when people are calling and they see this is where things are and so that they have some idea. I know City Planning has it on their website, but it's very confusing if you don't see it like outlined, like this is the current zoning stuff, in a chart like that. I think it would be very helpful.
Well-
You have to click on all the links on their site. Where
Well, as
this
I
would
said,
be helpful.
Councilwoman Strasburger has a really nifty chart.
Yeah,
I think
we'll
it's
ask
on
her
her
if she can put
website,
it
and
up,
we'll
yeah.
ask her if we can sort of
Yeah.
adopt it
Yeah, that'd be a
to the
very
city
good-
clerk's website so we can make it
Yeah.
more publicly available.
Yeah, and then maybe, since Councilman Wilson oversees city planning and his committee, maybe we can schedule some meetings about some conversations and how we can get to a place where we're all achieving what we want to achieve, having people have housing in Pittsburgh, but yet also seeing development occur. And I would like to see some of it occur more. Actually, some of the concerns I heard this past week, and actually from somebody from Squirrel Hill, was a developer from Squirrel Hill who's doing affordable or mixed income housing. And he was saying that he's having a lot of issues with PWSA, and so I don't know. It'd be helpful to have all those conversations. How can we move these things with our different authorities as well? So everything under one umbrella kind of thing. So that's it for me. Anything else? Any closing remarks? Yes.
I always have a lot of housing thoughts, and I just wanted to comment on.
Can I just say real quick? Councilwoman Strasburger said when she left, she said, "I can listen to Megan talk housing all day long."
Thank you for that. Oh, I simply I love this collaboration and discussion of identifying key points and working off of them. And I wanted to respond to Councilman Wilson's point about the 50% AMI not being responsive to the needs of the 30 to 120% AMI. And that's actually true, but what happens is in that ongoing conversation we can have is that the 50% AMI considerations bring down the fair market rent enough for the unit to be qualified for a housing choice voucher or for Section 8, and then 120% AMI is actually needed on the homeowner side in order to help homeowners in the middle class space obtain home ownership and intergenerational wealth. So I'm thrilled to see all these facts that council has been absorbing all last year, and that we can keep building off putting the facts in the right buckets, and also bringing the other city departments to the table, bringing DOMI to discuss street planning and safety in response to parking minimums and other considerations that interact with other city departments, not just city planning and zoning with these zoning discussions.
Thank you. Councilwoman Warwick.
I do just also quickly want to add, because I feel like they get, they take a lot of heat at PLI, and sometimes rightly so. But I do want to say, just since I've been here.
For them next week.
Yeah, but just because I've, in the short time that I've been here, there have been active improvements made, right? Like with the online portal, and updating the online portal so that, it used to be that you'd get a permit, oh, now I need this permit, now I need that permit, but now up front, and it's sort of more in more understandable language, and you can have more than one person, so that, if your contractor is telling you one thing, you can actually look. And so those improvements are happening. And now we also, of course, the 412 is open, so you can go in person if you're not a computer.
I think that's a huge one.
It's a huge one, right? So that is an improvement. That said, I still think that we do need more, specifically, because I don't want the developer community to think that I don't hear them. I do hear them. When you have a big project, it is a big project of 20 units is different than me putting a deck on the front of my house, right? The urgency, the money behind it, right, is different. So I do think that we need within PLI some type of like concierge service, so that those projects that are increasing our tax base, that are doing that are benefiting the city as a whole, as opposed to just that those things need to be moving faster. Those reviews need to be faster, and even if that is paid for, I think that's something that we still do need to work on. We have to make it easier.
Somebody
to get
from Squirrel Hill who gave me the idea of having a reviewer, but they told me it was if an architect signed off. Initially, it was one of the developers from Squirrel Hill told me, then it's good. But then the other one explained to me, no, it was something more like a deal with the organized labor. And so he said, it's not exactly the way it needs to be, but at least somewhat a little bit closer to where Chicago is.
We do need to be making, our PLI and our permanent, our building regulations need to be the same, right?
Yeah.
We want safe buildings, and we want those to be reviewed. We want our inspectors to be coming in and doing a thorough job. Right. Which I think is a problem sometimes for folks who, they come and look at whatever it is that have done. But those reviews need to happen faster, I
think that you're absolutely right. The reviews need to happen quicker, and I think we need to have a more streamlined process.
And that's with PWSA and DOMI and plumbing at the county. I mean, that's a big, larger
It's
issue.
everyone working together. Mm-hmm. Okay, is that it? Anything else? Thank you, Dan Friesen, for joining us online. And thank you for being here, Megan. Thank you, Sean, for filling in here so quickly. This meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.